Taxi Driver was a film that when I read the script, I really felt that that was something I had to make.
The serendipity of this particular film was that the three of us were in the same spot at the same time. We understood exactly what this story was about.
Marty wanted me to play the campaign worker, and when I read the script, I asked him if I could play the pimp.
De Niro was so frightening and so convincing once he started to lose it as that character.
What Marty wanted was the idea of trying to give advice to help somebody who's beyond help.
Doing something in the mirror, that idea fit the whole thing of somebody by themselves, talking to themselves, acting that way.
You have a guy like Travis Bickle, who's this very odd, almost despicable character who becomes this hero.
I thought at the time we were making a picture that wouldn't necessarily speak to many people. And I was surprised when it had such an acceptance. At that time, I was living in Los Angeles, and my closest friend out there was Brian De Palma. And he introduced me to Paul Schrader. And Paul Schrader was just making kind of a transition from criticism, film criticism, to film writing. And he had written several scripts, one of which was The Yakuza, which was sold to Warner Brothers for a huge fee at the time, I think, and established Paul as a very important writer. And I believe, it's all around the same time, he had written Taxi Driver earlier. And Brian said to me he would like to give me the script because he thought it would really be good for something that I could do.
I was a film critic, trying to be a film critic, and I graduated from UCLA. I was at AFI. And a number of things sort of went wrong in that when marriage broke up, somebody I was living with, that broke up, and I was without a place to live. So I was sort of drifting around. I didn't know quite what to do. And mostly staying in my car or in my ex-girlfriend's apartment. She was out of town. The power was actually, and the heat was actually off. I realized I hadn't spoken to anyone in several weeks, and that I'd just been living in this kind of isolated environment. And the metaphor of the taxi cab occurred to me as a metaphor for loneliness, a certain kind of male drifting loneliness. And I just wrote 2 drafts of the script continuously for 10 days, and it sort of jumped out of me like an animal.
I looked at it and read it, and I said, I want to do it. But of course, I had no track record. I just made an exploitation film for Roger Corman called Boxcar Bertha, that was all. So I tried to get everywhere I could, every party that Paul Schrader was at, or Michael and Julia Phillips were at. I would get there and sort of work the room, so to speak. And don't forget, I want to do Taxi Driver, and Julia Phillips was very nice, but said, listen, you don't have a track record, you have nothing. Says, after you come back after you've done more than Boxcar Bertha. So luckily at that time, 1972, I was editing Mean Streets. And so once they saw the picture, they felt that myself and De Niro as a team would help get a picture like that made. Right around the same time, I started another film, Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and Robert De Niro had won the Academy Award for Godfather 2, and that sort of helped.
I had known Bobby a little bit before then, but he was doing a movie in Italy while we were preparing to do Taxi Driver. He was doing a movie with Bertolucci called 1900. But De Niro would actually finish shooting on a Friday in Rome, get on a plane from Italy, fly to New York. He got himself a cab driver's license, and he would go to a garage and pick up a real cab and really drive the cab around New York. Then he would turn it in and fly back to Italy and work again. He did that a couple of times. So I was real impressed by this. And then I said, I'm going to get a cab driver's license and do the same thing. And then I said, wait a minute, it's crazy. I'm not going to do it.
I had 2 weeks to prepare. I was preparing while I was in Italy at the time off of 1900. In fact, I went to an army base in northern Italy to tape record the accents of some kids I met there who were from an area in the Midwest that I thought would be good for Travis, and I came back and started driving a cab right away.
My agent was Sue Mengers at the time, and Marty Scorsese knew Sue and called her up and said, Sue, I need a Sybil Shepherd type. And Sue Mengers said, Marty, how about the real thing?
I was doing a lot of stand-up comedy on television at the time, and I think that he was a fan, and that's sort of one of the things he liked to do in his casting was use people that hadn't been used yet. This was one of the roles that really wasn't even written. So our real job was to come up with what to say. I think that's really why Marty hired me, was he thought I could help do that. And I remember the funny story to me was that at the end of the movie, Paul Schrader came up to me and he said, "Thank you very much. Your character was the only one I didn't really know." And I'm thinking, I was the one you didn't know? That's just a simple guy who has a daily job. You knew the pimp and the guy who shot 80 people and all those others, but me you didn't know. I said, well, all right, I'm glad I could help.
What I recall is Marty giving me the script and telling me which part he'd like me to play. It wasn't the part of the pimp. Marty wanted me to play the campaign worker. And when I read the script, I asked him if I could play the pimp. And he said, it's such a small part. Because in the original script, I believe it was only about 5 lines. I said, I have an idea about him, and he said, okay. So I developed the part after that with Marty.
The character that Harvey played in my original script had been written as black. And then it was a hard decision, but we just felt it was too socially irresponsible. Because of the latent racism, not so latent racism of the main character, we felt that there might be a rise in violence in theaters if we went that way. So then we said we'll make Harvey's character, make him white. Him white and try to take, we'll leave the racism in the movie, and the racism is still in the movie, and Travis is a racist character. But we'll take the really incendiary stuff out of it.
When I first read the script, I threw it across the room. I was insulted to be offered such a nothing part. That's how I remember it. All due respect to Paul Schrader. When I went in to rehearse with Marty and De Niro, we ad-libbed on videotape. Scorsese had a black and white video camera which he handheld himself. And then that night, after we had gone home, Marty would go through and pick out, he would reconstruct the script using Paul Schrader's lines, but also using what he liked of what we improvised.
You know, there's a fine line of helping the movie or just overindulging or indulging and not furthering the story in a proper way. So we just were trying to improve for whatever reasons. At the time, we felt character-wise it'd be good for him to do this and that. Maybe flush out the scenes like the one with Sybil, trying to pick her up and so on.
People have a misconception of what improvisation is. Improvisation isn't when the movie camera is rolling, making stuff up, but it's done a lot earlier in a rehearsal situation. Then out of that, what the actors do and what Marty likes is set in stone, and then that's what you shoot.
That's usually why you do them, to flush them out or find something, looking for more elements that relate, that are good, and yet not overdo it so you just, sort of wallow in improvisation. You got to move forward, make the point, and move on.
Marty took a bunch of us and we went to this place called the Belmore Cafeteria, which for years had been a hangout for cab drivers. We met with a couple, including a guy who was an actual dispatcher. After we met, Marty said, "Do you have any ideas?" And I said, "Well, I'll just write up some notes." And I made a little cassette. This conversation, supposed to have this conversation with Travis, who was on the verge of going psychotic. So I said, "Well, Marty, this is what I think." And he said, "Well, that's good. I like that. And just give me the tape and it became part of the script."
I met this girl who was maybe 15. She's a working girl. So I invited this girl back to my room, my hotel, and I said, I just want you to meet somebody tomorrow morning. I'll give you some money, that's going to be that, This is a purely a social thing. But I was afraid if I lost her, I would never find her again. So I paid her to stay on the sofa in the hotel suite. And I put a note under Marty's door, and I said, "I met Iris last night, and we're going to have breakfast at 8 o'clock. Come down and meet us." So he came down, and a lot of what showed up in Jodie's performance, we saw that morning in that girl. The speech pattern, the sunglasses, the bread with the sugar and the jam on it. She was a junkie. It took a character that had been sort of theoretical and also made it real.
It is like a horror film in a way. It's a New York Gothic, we call it. But I didn't say we're going to make a new style or we're going to make the film very stylish. It's the way I saw it. And I drew as many of the shots as possible so that we wouldn't have a situation where we walk on the set and we didn't know where the camera was going to be placed.
Marty does the very best storyboards of anybody I've ever seen. And he does them in part, and I think it's very important, it's hard to explain this to anyone except from the inside. It's important that storyboards not be good, not be well drawn, and not be complete or artistic in any way. At least it's important to me. And Marty never did that. He did wonderful kind of little sketches like this, you know, and then it would be an arrow, and there would be blood, and it would be red. And it had a cartoon quality, and it gave vibrancy to what he was trying to express. They were like road directions, really, more than anything else. They pointed, they said, we're going this way with this, we're going to go this way, we're going to do this, you know. And that's why they were so good.
Before we shot the first scene, I arrived on the set early in the morning at this parking garage where the cabs shape up on the west side of Manhattan. And Marty was there and he was setting up the shot. And I said, how do you feel? How do you this? He didn't sleep too well last night. He had trouble sleeping, but he had made some sketches. And he had, in his own kind of drawing way, sketched out this opening sequence. But it came out of his insomnia and his restlessness.
The guy who picked me up in the morning then picked Marty up. Now, this was only the days I worked. You know, Marty, I guess, never got to bed until 4 a.m. because always he was still sleeping. And I would get out of the car and ring the door, and it was the same thing every morning, right? Oh, Marty, we're downstairs. Oh my God, oh my God, oh God, oh God, oh God. No, it's all right. It's, oh no, oh God. So, I think it was tough for him.
You know, Marty has an enormous visual sense and had strong ideas and strong images in his head. He did outrageous things. The shot where Robert De Niro goes this way and the camera goes that way and shows all his world that he experiences and then comes back and finds him. The crew were sort of shocked by it. You know, crews are very conservative in a curious way. And they made hundreds of shots following somebody. But the idea of letting him go that way and the camera go that way almost offended their sensibilities. After a while, they got used to that because they realized it was Marty, but none of them had worked with Marty before. And the idea of doing it was, I remember that that was the biggest thing I remember about it was how shocking it was to the crew and how it made them nervous. The movie's full of that, of Marty thinking of something that nobody had ever done. He's talking on the telephone, and then the camera goes that way and just shows this empty hall. It's full of that stuff. It's got lots of slow motion and all sorts of things. It's all part of making it a documentary of the mind, so that you see something strange happening and you know that it's in his head.
Scorsese was just one of my favorite experiences as an actor. He let those moments be so full between me and Albert Brooks. I remember Albert getting very irritated with me because I was doing my own makeup. Consequently, I was looking in the mirror quite often to check it, and he would snatch the mirror out of my hands and go, hey, I have to see how my makeup's looking. And everybody laughed.
That character is not funny like a comedian. He's funny like a real person. And everybody in their daily work makes jokes. That's what people do. But you don't want to become Robin Williams because then that's too funny, So that's the fine line. I mean, I in my life can be way funnier than that character, but that's not what I was trying to do. You try to be funny like a guy who really would work in a workplace. So Marty allowed for that. I mean, the great thing about Marty is that, he provides that amazing atmosphere in which you can create.
Ultimately, it was shot in New York City because New York City has such a heavy cab presence. But it is not necessarily a New York film. It is an urban film, though. I think it's in the script somewhere where I described him as someone who has wandered in from a place where it's cold and suddenly he's in this city. The city represents everything that is forbidden and crazy. It's where you go to be crazy. The irony, of course, is that it's the loneliest place. I mean, that's the dynamic, the tension, is here you have a character who is surrounded by people, yet it's a story of loneliness. And you can only do real, true loneliness in a crowded atmosphere.
I think playing opposite Robert De Niro is a challenge for any actor because he is a master of underplaying. And I think that's what helped my performance be good in Taxi Driver. I'm really proud of that. I don't know, it came real natural to me. I worked real hard. I make a lot of notes about subtext, and I change that as the script goes on. And I remember once rehearsing with De Niro, and I noticed that he had written also all over his script page, all the margins were covered with little notes, as mine was.
The taxi was a character, and the way we made it a character was we gave it its kind of freedom. We didn't hold the cab down. We just got in the cab like passengers or whatever and drove off all over the city doing this and doing that.
When we were shooting the scenes in the taxi, I think that would be my favorite part of doing it in a way, because Michael Chapman was the DP, and I think he was in there operating, and Scorsese was crunched in there in that cab, and I was there. And I love being self-contained as a little movie-making unit.
And Bobby De Niro had spent quite a bit of time as a taxi driver to experience what it was like. And he was a good driver, and we would just drive all night. We would do this stuff, and I had the very simplest lights. We never towed it. We just let it be. We would get inside. We would stick the sound man in the trunk, and we'd have battery packs in there, and Marty and I would crouch in the back seat. And that, I think, in retrospect, I think we did it at least consciously because we didn't have time or money. It was a very low-budget movie.
We also had lucky enough to have a second unit group that would go out under the direction of David Nichols and a young man who was a friend of mine from Boxcar Bertha and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore and Mean Streets. And he helped get shots that I wanted in the streets, shots of the taxi cab, close-ups, that sorts of thing.
Marty's been in dozens of movies in one way or another, and I thought he did a wonderful job. But that was an accident, because the guy was supposed to play it, had an accident on another movie and couldn't show up. And so Marty got in the back and did it.
Man, I'm going to kill him.
I guess when we were doing the scene, it was late and I was tired, but I mean, I was, you look through, you don't never turn around and look at somebody. You can, but I mean, I felt that you could usually look through the rearview mirror, and Marty, he was calling me, and I guess I said at the end of one take, I'm not gonna respond till you really make me turn around, or just for yourself, so it'll give you more.
This is how Marty is again. We're talking, and I said, I saw this guy on the street who stands on the street corner and plays drum solos, and he said, what do you, if you see the guy again, get his name. This is the director of a major film telling me this. So I actually did see the guy again. I got his name, I gave it to Marty, and the guy is in the movie.
The drummer, for example, street character, and we found a place to put him in the film, but it's very tricky because Paul Schrader's structure is so tight that we were always aware that if you're going to do something like that, he'd have to be in a place in the film where you can't cut him out.
When we went to see the Dirty movie, it was just like, I always hated that stuff.
He takes Betsy to that porn theater because there's something inside him that wants to sully her, and there's something inside of him that says, I'm worthless, and I should be alone.
De Niro was so frightening and so convincing. Once he started to lose it as that character, it was very easy to play terror. He frightened me to death on the set that day when he came in, when they dragged him out of the campaign headquarters.
He was the ultimate method actor, and he would not, Travis Bickle and my character would never have words together, and he, did not want to have words together when we were between takes, and I sort of respected that. I didn't go out of my way to start to make a conversation with him. So he played that guy. I mean, he was that guy. He was that guy during the breaks, and he was that guy.
When I set out to write the script, I thought it was about loneliness. As I wrote it, I realized it was about something a little different and more interesting, which was self-imposed loneliness. That is, a syndrome of behavior that reinforces itself. And the touchstones of that kind of behavior are all kinds of contradictory impulses, Puritanism and pornography at the same time. I've got to get healthy while popping pills at the same time. The dreadful diet. It's all full of these things that he does to make sure he'll never get where he's going. In other words, so he can reinforce his own doomed condition. Scorsese and De Niro and I, we all understood that completely. I mean, the serendipity of this particular film was that the three of us were in the same spot at the same time. We were in sync. And we didn't really need to communicate that much to each other. We understood exactly what this story was about.
Paul, he gave me his boots, for example, and I think he gave me either his jacket or his dungarees. We felt that was a good start. Jodie was, I think, 12 at the time. And I saw her in Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, and she was terrific in that, but she was still yet younger. I mean, was it a year or two before or more? But she was great, smart and a good person to work with at such a young age, too,
She was a very charming girl to be around, a lovely teenager, just pleasant to be in her company, and very smart. You could see her smartness, her brightness at that time. I remember her mother had cornered me and was giving me some advice about Hollywood, and I was standing there respectfully listening to her as her mother, who was a lovely lady also, was going on and on and on, and finally Jodie looked up at her mom and said, "Oh, Mom, he knows." I looked down at Jodie and I smiled, and that's the moment I always remember about her. That alertness she had, that intuitiveness. I lived in Hell's Kitchen at that time, and I used to see this one pimp for years, and he was dressed similarly to the way I was in Taxi Driver. I had asked for this wig to wear in the film. My hair had been cut short for this play I was doing at that time, and the producers wouldn't get me the wig. They said it cost too much money, and I had to go to Marty and tell him this, and he instructed them to get me whatever I needed. I was researching. I asked for some things that were happening on the street at that time. I found this idea, this person who told me about the fingernail. Some people grew a pinky fingernail long to scoop up cocaine with.
The improvisations were improvisations that, let me put it this way, could not hurt the structure of the script. I didn't want to get into the way of what Paul had written. In the scene where De Niro walks up and Keitel is in the doorway and mistakes him for a cop. The majority of the dialogue is Paul Schrader's dialogue, but we added a few things. Harvey was having a little fun, and we added a few lines.
Marty had said he wanted to expand my role and to have another scene. And we created that scene you see with me and Jodie dancing. I'd met some fellow, and we worked on it for a couple of weeks at the Actors Studio. We did improvisations. I played the girl, and then he taught me how to play the pimp, and then I would play the pimp and he'd play the girl. And the scene with Jodie Foster came as a result of these improvisations.
Well, the problem with the scene is that it's not entirely from Travis Bickle's point of view, so we violate the structure a little bit of the picture. And so we added a shot of Travis outside, knowing that they're up there in the apartment. And we try to tie that together that way. It's debatable. It's debatable. Does everything have to be from his point of view? At this point, I'm not quite sure.
What Marty wanted was the idea of trying to give advice to help somebody who's beyond help. You try and find something to say, well, like don't jump off the bridge because life is good, or so it was trying to be this rambling, disconnected kind of bits of wisdom, bits of cliches, bits of this and that, and we did it. We really did it pretty quickly. We did it in the middle of the night, and it came out pretty close to the way we improvised it. And De Niro is sensational because we just really went for it.
We improvised a little bit with Peter Boyle, and also Robert De Niro and the FBI agent at the campaign rally. And of course, the improvisation with De Niro with himself in the mirror. This was towards the end of shooting the mirror scene. And we felt that we had a space that we could open the picture there, you see, in these places, and play around with some ideas.
Well, that one particular line was unscripted. It simply said in the script something to the effect that he looks into the mirror and talks to himself. And Bob said, what does he say? And I said, it's like a kid playing with a toy gun in front of a mirror.
We were doing the scene, and I forget what the actual dialogue in the scene was, but that seemed like something that, doing something in a mirror we've all done. I thought it would be something, you know, saying, how about if I say this or that? And knowing Marty, you know, the way we worked, he'd let it roll. Because sometimes you come up with some good stuff. That idea fit the whole thing of somebody by themselves, talking themselves, acting that way, seemed appropriate for the moment.
Now, the Mohawk is interesting. We had a friend of ours named Vic Magnato, who's now unfortunately passed away. We went to NYU together, Vic and I, and then he was in Vietnam, Special Services or something. And we met with him before doing some research on the film. And he talked about certain types of soldiers going into the jungle. They cut their hair a certain way, looked like a Mohawk, he said. And you knew that there was a special situation, commando kind of situation. And people gave them wide berths in a way. And we thought that was a good idea.
First, he cuts his hair into a crew cut. So we had to paste his own hair down as flat to his head as possible so we could get this wig on very snugly and looking like a crew cut. And then he shaves his head. Most people think he really did shave his head. We couldn't do that. He had to keep his long hair for other scenes. I've done bald caps, of course, before, and I had done some that looked like a shaven head, but I did that mainly with stippling on little black dots and things of that sort. I wanted to do real short little bits of hair to make it really look like it was shaven. I used actually a very coarse hair, not human hair, because the harder it is in form, the better it blows and scatters. It won't clump together. We always use a fresh one each day of the shooting because they have very thin edges. Those are kind of destroyed when you remove the cap. And it was very tricky each morning doing this on a fresh cap. And Bobby is a perfectionist, so he would inspect every square inch of the stubble, and we would fuss with it and get it all beautiful and get the hairline just right. And then, of course, put on that roach, that funny hair piece that goes across the top of his head. That was a separate piece, and that was the easiest thing. We also had to invent a kind of a hair paste that would glue his own hair as flat to his skull as possible so that we could do the bald cap and not have it look bulky.
The idea was that it was the psychopath's suicidal fantasy. It was his apotheosis, his coming into glory. So at that point, you're almost inside his head, and you're in a world of glorified bloodshed, including his own, almost past realism, and probably inspired by Wild Bunch, which had an ending of pathological suicidal glory, you know, just labored of these four men entering into the psychopath's heaven. And so that's sort of what was the thinking behind the script. And the thinking was, you know, the bloodier the better.
That's the way the story resolved itself, and great violence. That's the character. You know, the difference between people who have fantasies and keep them as fantasies, and there's a difference between people who try to act out the fantasies, and he's one of them. I mean, it's all there in the picture, why it's violent. The violence was shot as written, and it was designed very carefully, and took quite a while to do.
You know, Marty is very good at this stuff, and we worked this out together. In other words, I would say, well, I can't really put a knife right through a guy's hand. And he said, well, I could edit, I could do this and so forth. So, you know, part of these schemes for getting these illusions are definitely part of the director's creativity as well. He knows what he wants, and he knows how he can fudge it, you know, to get what he wants. The script was clear. There were storyboards of every bit of action. The problems for me were much of the action was in a long, narrow hallway, and then a staircase, etc.
We took over a condemned building in New York on 89th Street and Columbus Avenue, and we built Travis's apartment in that building, and we built Iris's apartment, and we used the hallway.
And we started at the ground floor, and we worked our way up. And so as you went, there's blood everywhere, you know, there's paint, I mean, it's movie blood, but as you go up, it just gets bloodier and bloodier and bloodier. So every day as we walked up, we'd walk into this more intense red blood everywhere on the walls, and streaks and blood. And it was like going into a sort of abattoir day after day. It was intense. It was extremely intense.
The toughest effect was to blow off the hand of the man who was guarding the staircase. If we weren't confined in this narrow set, if I could have stood nearby, I would have used a monofilament to just yank off part of a false hand. And that would have been simple to do. but I couldn't get anywhere near it because of the being confined in this set. So I decided I'd have to blow it off with squibs, which are little explosive charges. So this was quite an engineering job. The problem is, what do you do with his own hand? What you add on is going to look like an awfully long arm. So I made a cast over his fist, and then I designed a false hand out of rubber and plastics and so forth that would fit over his fist, and it would only extend out a little ways. What I was doing was making a hand that had the thumb still, but the palm was cut off. That was a solid device. It had tubes to pump blood, concealed, etc. Then I made, out of a brittle wax, a reproduction of the missing part of the hand, the upper palm and the fingers. They could slip over this permanent device. In the hollow wax hand, were concealed the explosive charges and pockets of blood. So the action then would be, bang, blow off the hand. It would be shattered into many pieces. Then blood would start pumping from what was left, from the permanent stump that was left, and that would spray all over the place. So it was truly a bloody mess. Murray Mostyn, who acted the part of this guard that got his hand blown off, was very easy to work with. He was only a kind of part-time actor, actually. I think he was in the jewelry business. And it was just a lot of fun for him. De Niro shot Harvey Keitel out on the street, but Keitel follows him as he's dying, and he shoots him and wings him in the side of the neck. And I invented a new device. That was the first time I used it. I made a plastic appliance that had a tube concealed in it that could be connected to a source of blood. Then I cut out a strip in this that was like a piece of flesh that would be blown out. And that was put on a monofilament fishing line, stuck back in with a little paste, and then when the shot occurs, I rip out that little wedge there, revealing the slot, the womb, and the blood is pumped at the same time. Now, because that was in that damn hallway, that narrow hallway, I couldn't get near him. I had to pull that out with a fishing line. I had a fishing pole, a bamboo fishing pole, with a fishing line on it. And that fishing line was attached to his thing, and with a mirror or some damn thing, or a cue, I had to rip that fish out. After each take, or each scene, we will take Polaroids of Bobby with bloodstains on his face at various intervals, so that if we go back and do another take, or we have to follow that the next day, I know where to put the blood and get it close enough so no one will notice the difference. The scene further up in Jodie Foster's room, a man comes with his gun and shoots at De Niro. De Niro then shoots him in the face 4 times. So I'd make appliances which were hollow, which contained blood, and fit on, say, his cheekbones and his forehead, to which fishing line, a monofilament, was attached. Well, rigging this with 4 on the face was a big job. It took a couple of hours. And I'm pasting them on very carefully and blending them in, injecting the blood in and all that. And then I have all these long monofilaments. I had to have, several feet of them. Well, it's very fine stuff. So I would wrap it up on a little roll, and I would bobby pin it up into the actor's hair to get it out of the way. So he's got all these strings into his hair here. And now, be careful, don't touch them. Well, my back is turned, and the actor's girlfriend arrives on the scene, comes in, gives him a big hug, looks up and says, "Oh, you've got a hair on your face." And she grabs one of these monofilaments and is just in the act of pulling it. And I turn around and scream. Caught her just almost in time. She didn't pull it out, but she loosened it enough it started leaking a little bit. But I was able to patch it up, so I didn't have to do the whole thing over again. There's a further effect on the man whose hand was blown off. He comes into the room and he tackles De Niro with his remaining good hand. De Niro, in the meantime, has pulled a knife out of his boot or someplace, and he brings it up just as this hand is coming down, and the knife goes right through his hand. This trick effect was done by filming the action of the knife going towards the hand. I think he had a retractable blade. And then there's a cut, and I attached a fake knife that had a handle here and then a heavy wire linking it around to a blade sticking through. And I covered this to conceal it and put a lot of blood on it. And when the film is edited together, you get the illusion of the knife going right through the hand. I've got an amusing picture of Murray relaxing there with a cigarette, and it's in the hand with the knife through it. And the knife is there, and he's still holding the cigarette, puffing away.
In those situations, they're so gruesome, those kind of scenes, and you're waiting around for things. So you kind of like everybody gets a little silly and you joke around because it's so. And I imagine I've heard this, people who are in those real situations, like people who go on crime scenes and stuff like that, or do very dangerous kind of work, going into situations that they are really they make jokes and kid with each other. What else are you going to do? I mean, it's not going to change anything. So that's kind of like when we're doing those scenes, with all that blood and violence, and like it's joking around.
When the man with the hand blown off is finally shot, you don't see anything happen in front, but you see the results. You see blood suddenly spray out of the back of the head against the wall or whatever is there. So that's the special effects department. And they put a plate on the back of the head to protect it. Then they put an explosive charge, and then a bag of blood, maybe with some bits and pieces in it even, and put that on the back of the explosive. And then when they blow it, you get this horrible spray of blood and stuff.
The tracking shot at the end, looking directly down at them at the end of the shootout, is an example of how good Paul Schrader's script is, because the script describes the camera looking down and pulling back and going all the way down the hallway and outside. Now, that was impossible to do because we didn't have a stage. We had an old brownstone on 80th Street, and the exterior is somewhere down on the Lower East Side. So we couldn't do that, but we tried as best we could to do the nearest equivalent that we could think of. And that turned out to be cutting the ceiling open.
For 3 months, they were digging into the ceiling so that we'd eventually get the one shot at the end. While we were shooting in there, we'd stop the digging and they'd put the ceiling up and that sort of thing. But that was being worked on for like 3 months.
I went up into the floor above and I took a piece of chalk and I drew where I assumed it would, kind of hoped it would be. And the grips came with chainsaws and cut it open. And the building began to come apart because we cut all the beams. The building was barely standing anyway. So they had to go running around and prop the whole building up so we could do it because it was going to come apart like a piece of cake.
Finally, we got to shoot it, but we were really, really hampered by the, Jody was 12 years old, so we had certain labor laws to deal with, and we always shot late. We always went over schedule for the day. And we wound up, at that point, I remember, it was very tension-filled because we only had 20 minutes to shoot it once we lined it up because of the child labor laws. We did it in 20 minutes, 2 takes or 3 takes.
We built a track and we hung the operator looking straight down. I think he's actually hand-holding the camera. And we pulled him. The grips pulled him along to make that shot.
Marty had shot the picture in New York, obviously, and decided not to do any editing at all while he was shooting. And he wanted to wait until he finished shooting, took a vacation, then came back. And Marcia Lucas, who was the original editor, had viewed the dailies, but she hadn't cut anything. Nothing had been done. And I think the first or second day back at the Columbia lot, got word that they said, well, I hope you realize that you have to turn over a print of this thing by, I think it was February 28th or something, and this was January 1st. And nobody looked at the contract, and nobody realized what the turnover date was, so there was a major panic. So because my assistant had known Marty, he recommended that I come on board, which I did. And Marcia Lucas and I started as, putting it together. And then finally we were so under the gun that we brought a third party in who stayed in, Mel Shapiro, who had been an old friend of mine. It became kind of a homogeneous cutting process because we all worked on each other's material. And the three of us just cranked on it until we finished it on time.
Even Steve Spielberg came in at one point. He said hello to me in the editing room, and I was having trouble making one of the cuts in the violence scene. He helped make it. So there are a lot of people who helped.
Marty, he had very original thinking, and one thing he taught me was something I had never realized before, and it truly has served me well over the years, I think. By hanging on a shot for a long time, you get to the point where I would sit there and I'd say, oh, Jesus, that's way too long. I got to trim that, And then he'd say, no, make it longer, make it longer. When I would think that would be exactly the opposite from what my instinct was. But what happens, and he's dead right, is if you make it inordinately long, the audience then looks at it and they say, what am I looking at this image for such a long time? And then they start reinvesting into the shot. So it's like a second time around, like an athlete getting his breath again. And you look at it from a different perspective. It's a wonderful revelation. There's one scene where Travis starts to turn and he's saying a word, and then we go back and start it over again. And he turns, and I remember that one always kind of threw me, but it was very effective. I thought it was just too violent. And I was always very concerned about that. I didn't think we could get it by the MPA. I remember when the man's thumb, part of his hand is removed. As I recall, it was like, that's too much. Take one more frame off. No, let's put one frame back on. It was just really right down to the sprockets, how many you left on.
In order that they could keep their R rating, as I understand it. In the final shootout, the colors are, in fact, desaturated. This was not my choice, and this was done in post-production. And it was done because they delivered a movie which everybody found way too shocking to get an R. And in order to satisfy the rating board, they had to finally promise to desaturate the colors. I mean, I guess it had to be done, but I myself find that very sad, because the original stuff, when it's not desaturated, it looks like, there's a shot from overhead with all the mess. It looks like a Rauschenberg. I meant it to look like a Rauschenberg, and the colors are incredibly vibrant. And they had to take it out. I'd always wished that we could have found that negative before it deteriorated. And when it was going to go out on Laserdisc, I tried to find it, because I supervised the Laserdisc of it, but it was too late. It was, those negatives in the 70s just deteriorated so rapidly there was no color left that you could get.
When I read the script and had meetings with the Phillipses, at the point in which they decided that I was able to make the film, having had seen Mean Streets, we had many meetings while I was doing Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore in 1974. And during that time, I said, there's only one person who could really do the music for this, is Bernard Herrmann, because I'd become aware of his music over the years. I didn't know the name when I was a film goer. I didn't say, when I saw his name come up on the screen, oh, this could be good music. I just became aware that I liked the music of a certain film. And later on television, years later, I'd see these films and I saw that the music was all written usually by Bernard Herrmann. I liked his rhapsodic music in Vertigo, Marnie, and I knew some filmmakers in Holland, Pim de la Pera and Wim Verstappen, and they had worked with Bernard Herrmann. They said he was living in London, and so they made the connection, introduced us. He was very tough, and he said, I don't do films about cab drivers. I said, no, this is very different. It's not really a cab driver. I said, it's not really a taxi driver. He happens to be a taxi driver, but it's very character. So, all right, send the script. So he looked at it, and then I met him in London, and we had a lunch, and he liked the script and said he would do it. And so that's how it all came together. And I'd never really worked with a composer. It was the first time.
There was the sense of menace and madness, which is a lot what that movie's about, a person going mad. But I think in the other theme had a lot to do more with the internal person, something to do with the New York feeling. I know that he had a lot of trouble coming up with that theme. And it was Christopher Palmer, who worked with him a great deal toward the end of his life, remembered Herrmann wrote at one time something like that thing and brought it to Herrmann's attention. And Herrmann said, yes, that's what we need. So it was kind of an afterthought. He was having trouble getting to that place, which he finally did, because Herrmann was by that time very ill when he did that score. He had a heart condition. He had a weak heart. In fact, he should have never flown, to Hollywood at that point with his condition. And he also conducted the first day of the recording. The score was recorded in 2 days. He recorded the first day of the score, and Jack Hayes, who had worked with him on it, conducted the second day of the score, and that night he died.
It was December 23rd, 22nd, 23rd, 24th. And the night he finished the score is the night he passed away, and the Universal Sheraton Hotel in Universal City. It was his last score. What happened was that he was then nominated for the Academy Award for that score, but he also was nominated for the score of Brian De Palma's Obsession. And so he canceled himself out, unfortunately, in the Oscar sweepstakes, so to speak. But that was his last picture.
There was a woman who shot President Ford. She was a little crazy. Anyway, she ended up on the cover of Newsweek, which at that time was a big deal, before the proliferation of the media we know today. And it struck me as being wrong that if some crazy woman shoots the president, she gets on the cover of the biggest magazine, when all the people who have accomplished things don't. So I used that ending as a comment on our cultural values. You can work to cure cancer for 40 years and never be acknowledged, but take a shot at the president and you get to be a hero. Because in the world of media and fame and celebrity, there are no values. So once you're on the cover, you're on the cover. It doesn't matter how you got there. Travis Bickle, even though he's a psychopath, even though he tried to kill the senator, even though he killed bystanders in this brothel, he's now a hero because he's famous. It doesn't mean he's changed. He's the same. He's going to go off and start doing it again, given his way that he was thinking and his pattern of behavior. He is not cured.
I implied at the end when he looks in the mirror, thinks he sees something in the back, the car or in the street. I just think he's like a ticking time bomb that's going to go off again at some point, either towards other people or to himself.
I liked the ending. I thought it made sense. It was making a comment about, that sort of situation, which happens a lot more these days. Someone like him, becoming a hero in an odd way.
After the film came out, I had an office at Columbia, and I came back after lunch, and the pool secretary who was there said to me, don't go in your office, there's someone there. I said, who is it? She said, I don't know, he just came in, he wouldn't say who he was. So I went in my office, and there's a young man there, and he said to me, I want to know how you found out about me. So what do you mean? He said, well, I've hitchhiked down from Seattle. I saw this movie, Taxi Driver. Who told you about me? And I said, well, so let me get this straight. You probably were a taxi driver. You wrote about being a taxi driver, and you feel that I have somehow stolen your idea. He said, no. No, he said, I was never a taxi driver. I want you to know who told you about me. And I realized, that he was that thing. And actually, I was sort of a little concerned that he might be armed. And I said to him, I said, you may think that the pain you are going through is terribly unique, but it isn't. I went through it, and the people who made this film with me know what it is, and hundreds of thousands of other young men out there know exactly what that pain is. And when they see this movie, they recognize it. And what you are recognizing is not something that is uniquely you. It is part of a pathology that we share. And one of the beauties of recognizing it is you realize you are not alone, and that you can see yourself in context. And so that experience of talking to that young man, made me realize that we in fact had created the real thing. That we had actually cut through and nailed a certain character in life. Years later, when I was scouting in New Orleans a film, it came over the radio that President Reagan had been shot, and I heard a little description of the assailant. And I said to the driver, it's one of those taxi driver kids. And sure enough, we got back to the hotel, and the FBI was waiting for me. And they grabbed me as soon as I walked in the lobby. And John Hinckley had already gone into his taxi driver fascination. And, they wanted to know whether he had approached me and whether it was a conspiracy, whether there was anyone else involved. But it is a particular kind of breed of white boy, these taxi driver people. We will always have that character, and I honestly believe in censorship, and I do believe that artists should be responsible, and I'm not someone who says you can do anything. But you are not going to get rid of the John Hinckleys of this world by censoring art. They are more triggered by a lot of things out there. They're triggered by commercials and by advertisements on fashion. What will happen if you censor genuine studies of this kind of pathology? You will still have the pathology, you just won't have the study. In other words, you will still have Raskolnikov, but you won't have Crime and Punishment. That's all that will happen. You will lose the work of art that comments on the character, but the character will still be going along his merry way because he really wasn't created by art. And art, when it's done right, really is a curve and helps these people put their lives in perspective to the extent that they can. People have asked, why this particular film seems to survive. And I think one of the reasons is that it is absolutely the real thing. I can't hardly think of anything that's false in it. It is a genuine kind of statement of a certain pathology from inside the minds of three men who were locked into it and understood it.
Taxi Driver was a film that when I read the script, I really felt that it was something I had to make. I really understood the emotions and the not necessarily psychology. Let me put it this way: if I could verbalize it, I wouldn't have to make the picture. And then Schrader could verbalize it. He was able to write it on the page, and I felt all those feelings in that story. At that time, I was 31, 32 years old, and really felt that way at times. And so this was something I thought that was special to express. De Niro, I think, felt very strongly about it too. I thought at the time we were making sort of a labor of love, a picture that wouldn't necessarily speak to many people, maybe to a darker side of some people. But, and I was surprised when it had such an acceptance of an audience.